January 17th, 1288. Bach Dang River Estuary, northern Dai Viet. General Togan watches the morning mist rise from the river, revealing a landscape that has already swallowed 2 Mongol armies. The water is dark, reflecting clouds that promise rain. Behind him, 400 war junks stretch toward the horizon, the largest naval force the Yuan dynasty has ever assembled for the conquest of this stubborn southern kingdom. On the deck of his command vessel, he can hear the creak of wood, the slap of waves against hulls, and the murmur of 20,000 soldiers preparing for what should be an inevitable victory. Kublai Khan's patience has run out. The great Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest empire the world has ever known, has sent Togan with explicit instructions: crush the Tran dynasty, subjugate Dai Viet, and finally complete the southern expansion that has eluded the Mongols for 2 decades. Togan rolls his shoulders, feeling the weight of his armor and the weight of history. His forces have already swept through the Vietnamese interior, captured the capital of Tang Long, and forced the Vietnamese court to flee into the mountains like bandits. But Togan knows what his officers whisper around their fires at night. This is the 3rd invasion. The first, in 1258, ended in stalemate and withdrawal. The second, in 1285, saw Prince Togan's father, General Sojitu, killed by a Vietnamese crossbow bolt during the retreat. The Vietnamese are not the Jurchens or the Song Chinese. They do not fight pitched battles they cannot win. They vanish into rice paddies and jungle, strike from nowhere, and melt away before the Mongol cavalry can respond. General, his second-in-command, a grizzled Mongol officer named Inalchi, approaches with a map. The scouts report that Tran Hung Dao has withdrawn his forces up the Bach Dang River. Our spies say he is perhaps 10,000 men, poorly equipped, low on supplies. Togan studies the map. The Bach Dang River is wide here, navigable, defensible from the sea. It's the perfect place for the Vietnamese to make their last stand, or more likely, to delay the Mongols while their king escapes further south. Tran Hung Dao. Togan says the name slowly. The Vietnamese commander is 72 years old, a scholar general who has spent 3 decades studying the Mongol way of war. He's waiting for us. Let him wait. Inalchi grins. We have 400 ships. We have siege weapons, marines, and the momentum of victory. When we sail up that river, we'll finish what we started. But Togan doesn't share his officer's confidence. Something about this feels wrong. Tran Hung Dao is no fool. He wouldn't retreat to a river unless he had a plan. The old general has been preparing for this moment since the Mongols first crossed into Dai Viet 6 months ago, burning villages, destroying rice stores, implementing the same scorched earth tactics that brought down kingdoms from Baghdad to Kiev. The Vietnamese response had been different than expected. Instead of surrendering, they burned their own capital before the Mongols could occupy it. Instead of fielding armies, they fielded ghosts, peasants who knew every trail, every ford, every ambush point. Togan's supply lines stretched thin. His cavalry, the terror of the steppes, floundered in the waterlogged rice paddies. His soldiers began falling to disease, to poison water, to arrows that came from darkness and disappeared into it. And now Tran Hung Dao wants them to follow him up the Bach Dang River. Togan looks at the water again. The tide is high now, the river deep and inviting. By nightfall, it will be low tide, and the riverbed will be exposed, mud and sand, and whatever secrets lie beneath. He thinks of his father, Sojitu, dying in a similar retreat 3 years ago, and makes his decision. We move at dawn tomorrow, Togan announces. High tide. We'll sail with the current and crush whatever remains of their forces. Send word to all captains, full battle formation. Siege weapons armed. Marines ready for landing operations. Around him, officers nod and disperse to relay commands. The great fleet begins to stir, sailors checking rigging, soldiers sharpening weapons, the machinery of conquest grinding forward with the inevitability of avalanche. What Togan doesn't know, what he cannot know, is that 10 miles upriver, Tran Hung Dao stands knee-deep in mud, watching his soldiers hammer the last of 10,000 iron-tipped stakes into the riverbed. The old general's hands are calloused, his robes are filthy, and his eyes burn with the intensity of a man who knows he is about to gamble his nation's survival on a single, impossible trick. The same trick that defeated a Chinese invasion fleet at this exact spot in 938 AD. The same trick that the Mongols, in their arrogance, have never bothered to study. 3 weeks earlier, January 1st, 1288, Vandon coastal village, 60 miles east of Tanglong. Tran Hung Dao kneels in the mud beside a young soldier who cannot be more than 16 years old. The boy's hands are bleeding, blisters torn open from 3 days of driving wooden stakes into the riverbed. Around them, thousands of other soldiers work in organized chaos, waist-deep in cold water, hammering iron-tipped poles into the soft bottom of the Bach Dang River. "Commander," the boy says, his voice hoarse. "My hands." "I know," Tran Hung Dao says softly. He reaches into his own robes and produces a strip of cloth, begins wrapping the boy's hands with the efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times in the past week. "But we have 3 more days of work. The Mongols are at Tanglong. They believe they have won. They will come for us soon. And when they do, this river must be ready." The boy nods, swallowing his pain. Around them, the sound of hammering continues, a percussion that has become the heartbeat of the Vietnamese resistance. 10,000 stakes, each one carefully measured to rise just below the waterline at high tide. Each one positioned in precise rows that form an invisible maze beneath the surface. Each one sharpened to a point that can pierce the hull of a war junk. Tran Hung Dao stands, his knees protesting. At 72, he feels every one of his years. He has served 3 kings, fought in dozens of campaigns, and spent the last 30 years preparing for this exact moment. When he was a young officer, he studied the victory of No Nguyen at this very river in 938, how a Vietnamese commander had used the same tactic to destroy a Chinese invasion fleet. The history books called it genius. Tran Hung Dao calls it necessity. "General," a scout splashes through the shallows, mud covering him to the chest. "The Mongol fleet has been sighted at Vandon Harbor. 400 ships. They're preparing to move." Tran Hung Dao's expression doesn't change, but something in his eyes sharpens. "How long?" 2 days, perhaps 3. They're waiting for favorable winds. "Perfect." The old general turns to his senior officers, men who have followed him through 2 previous Mongol invasions, who have watched their country burned and occupied, who have learned that against an enemy as powerful as the Yuan dynasty, survival requires more than courage. It requires cunning. "Double the work crews," he orders. "We work through the night. Every stake must be in position before the Mongols enter the river. And send word to the fire ship teams. I want them ready to move on my signal." One of his officers, General Tran Hung Dao, steps forward. He's younger than Tran Hung Dao, but his hair is already gray from stress. "Commander, even with the stakes, we're facing 400 ships, 20,000 soldiers. If the trap fails, Dai Viet falls," Tran Hung Dao says simply. "The Mongols have conquered half the world. They destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire in 3 years. They leveled Baghdad. They brought the Song dynasty to its knees. They do not lose battles, Khan Do. They lose wars, when their enemies refuse to fight the way the Mongols expect." He turns back to the river, watching his soldiers work. Fishermen and farmers, merchants and scholars, all of them transformed into engineers of war. They don't have the Mongol cavalry. They don't have the siege weapons or the military infrastructure of the Yuan dynasty. What they have is knowledge of their own land, the patience to prepare an ambush that takes weeks to construct, and the desperation of people fighting for their home. "The Mongols will come with high tide," Tran Hung Dao continues, his voice carrying across the water. "They'll want deep water for their fleet. We'll let them sail past the first line of stakes, make them think the river is safe. Then we'll engage them with our light boats, fast vessels that can maneuver in shallow water. We'll provoke them, make them chase us upriver. And when the tide goes out," Tran Hung Dao asks, though he already knows the answer. "When the tide goes out," Tran Hung Dao says, and for the first time, A grim smile crosses his weathered face. The river becomes a graveyard. The hammering continues. 16 hours a day, the Vietnamese soldiers drive stakes into the mud. They work in shifts, teams replacing teams, the weak supporting the strong. Some collapse from exhaustion. Some develop infections in their hands. But none of them stop, because they understand what's at stake. By January 10th, 5,000 stakes are in place. By January 15th, 8,000. By January 17th, the day Togen's fleet prepares to sail, all 10,000 stakes stand silent beneath the water, invisible at high tide, lethal at low. An iron forest waiting for harvest. Tran Hung Dao stands at the river's edge on the evening before the battle. Alone now, the work complete. He thinks about his king, Tran Nan Tong, hiding in the mountains with what remains of the court. He thinks about the peasants who burned their own crops rather than let the Mongols have them. He thinks about the 300 years of independence his people have fought to maintain against larger, stronger enemies. The water is still. The stakes are invisible. Tomorrow, the Mongols will come, confident in their superiority, certain of their victory. And Tran Hung Dao will teach them the oldest lesson in warfare, the difference between strength and wisdom, between conquest and survival, between an empire that takes and a people who refuse to be taken. Chapter 3. The Bait. January 18th, 1288. Dawn. Bach Dang River entrance. The Mongol fleet moves like a leviathan awakening. 400 war junks catch the morning wind, their sails unfurling in a choreographed wave of canvas and rope. From his command vessel, Togen watches the vanguard ships enter the mouth of the Bach Dang River, their hulls cutting through water that gleams like polished bronze in the early light. The tide is high, perfect conditions for naval operations. General Inalchi reports, pointing upriver. No resistance at the river mouth. The Vietnamese haven't even posted sentries. Togen frowns. This feels wrong. Tran Hung Dao is too experienced to leave a strategic waterway undefended. Unless he has so few troops left that he can't afford to waste them on a defensive position that can't hold. The thought brings Togen no comfort. He's learned to distrust easy victories in this cursed country. The fleet advances. 200 ships in the first wave, another 200 following at a distance. The river is wide here, easily accommodating the massive vessels. Marines stand ready on the decks, crossbows loaded, swords drawn. Archers occupy the fighting platforms mounted on the masts. Everything is prepared for battle. But no battle comes. The fleet sails 3 miles upriver without incident. The water remains deep. The banks are empty of defenders. Togen begins to wonder if Tran Hung Dao has already fled further inland, abandoning the river entirely. Then, as the sun climbs higher, a scout in the crow's nest shouts down. Vessels ahead. Small boats, perhaps 30 of them. Togen raises his spyglass. Through the lens, he can see them. Light Vietnamese fishing boats converted for war, each carrying perhaps 20 soldiers. They're arranged in a loose formation across the river, blocking the channel. It's laughable. 30 small boats against 400 war junks. It's not a defense. It's a gesture of defiance from a defeated enemy. Prepare to engage. Inalchi roars, and across the Mongol fleet, war drums begin to beat, a thunderous rhythm that echoes off the water and the distant hills. But before the Mongol vessels can close the distance, the Vietnamese boats do something unexpected. They turn and flee. Not in panic, but in organized retreat, their rowers pulling with practiced coordination, moving upriver at surprising speed. They're running, an officer laughs. The old general finally shows his true colors, cowardice. But Togen doesn't laugh. He watches the Vietnamese boats maintain their distance, close enough to chase, far enough to stay out of range. This isn't retreat. This is follow them. Togen orders, his voice tight. But slowly. Keep formation. Watch for ambushes on the banks. The Mongol fleet pursues. The Vietnamese boats stay just ahead, occasionally turning to fire volleys of arrows that fall harmlessly short, taunting their pursuers. It's infuriating. It's also working. The Mongol ships are moving deeper into the river, committed to the chase. 5 miles upriver. 6 miles. 7. On the lead Vietnamese boat, a young commander named Tran Quoc Ton watches the Mongol fleet spread out behind him like a predator's jaws. He's 28 years old, nephew of Tran Hung Dao, and he's terrified. Not of dying. He made peace with that possibility months ago, but of failing. Of leading the Mongols too fast or too slow. Of revealing the trap too early or springing it too late. How much further? His second asks, breathing hard from rowing. Tran Quoc Ton checks the landmarks his uncle taught him. A distinctive bend in the river, a cluster of banyan trees on the eastern bank, a rock formation that looks like a sleeping dragon. They're close. Very close. 2 more bends, he says. Then we make our stand. Behind them, the Mongol fleet is now fully committed to the river. The vanguard has pushed 8 miles inland. The rear guard is just entering the river mouth. The entire force is strung out in a line nearly 10 miles long, a dragon stretched thin, its head chasing prey while its tail remains unaware of danger. On the eastern bank, hidden in dense vegetation, Tran Hung Dao watches through the trees. He can see his nephew's boats, see the Mongol fleet in pursuit, see the water level, still high, but beginning to retreat as the tide shifts. Beside him, a junior officer holds a red banner, waiting for the signal. Not yet, Tran Hung Dao murmurs. Let them get comfortable. Let them think they've won. The sun reaches its zenith. The tide begins its inexorable retreat. And in the command vessel of the Mongol fleet, Togan notices something that makes his blood run cold. The water level is dropping. Not gradually, as it should with normal tidal patterns, but quickly, faster than he's ever seen a tide change. And ahead, the Vietnamese boats have stopped fleeing. They've turned to face the Mongol fleet, formed a battle line, and are holding position as if daring the Mongols to attack. General, Inalchi says slowly, staring at the water. The river. And then Togan sees it. About 50 yards ahead of his command vessel, the water is churning strangely, creating patterns that shouldn't exist. As he watches, a wooden pole breaks the surface, just for a moment, before the water covers it again. Then another, and another. A forest of stakes planted in the riverbed, invisible at high tide, but rising as the water recedes. Back, Togan screams. All ships, reverse course. It's a trap. It's a trap. But it's too late. The vanguard ships are already among the stakes, their hulls grinding against wood and iron. And behind them, 300 more vessels are pushing forward, unable to stop their momentum, unable to turn in the narrowing channel. On the eastern bank, Tran Hung Dao raises his hand. The officer beside him waves the red banner 3 times. And all along the riverbanks, 10,000 Vietnamese soldiers emerge from hiding, drums beating, horns blaring, voices rising in a war cry that has echoed through these valleys for 1,000 years. January 18th, 1288. 2 p.m. Bach Dang River, 8 miles inland. The first Mongol war junk strikes a stake with the sound of splintering wood that carries across the water like a scream. The iron-tipped pole punches through the hull 3 feet below the waterline, driven upward by the ship's own momentum and the falling water level. For a moment, the vessel shudders, as if uncertain whether to continue forward or surrender to physics. Then the river makes the decision. Water pours through the breach. The ship lists heavily to starboard, and 200 Mongol Marines scramble across a tilting deck toward a safety that doesn't exist. From his command vessel, Togan watches in horror as the catastrophe multiplies. The second vanguard ship strikes stakes moments later, then the third, then the fourth. The water level continues to drop. What was navigable river 30 minutes ago is becoming a minefield of wood and iron. Ships that try to reverse course find themselves driving onto stakes behind them. Ships that try to anchor find the riverbed too soft, the current too strong. The entire vanguard, 50 war junks carrying 10,000 men, is trapped in a killing zone that tightens with every inch the tide recedes. Fire ships, Inalchi shouts, pointing upriver. They're launching fire ships. Through the chaos, Togan sees them. 20 small Vietnamese vessels, their decks piled high with straw and wood, already burning as they're released into the current. The wind is from the north, pushing the fire ships directly into the stalled Mongol fleet. It's brilliant. It's devastating. It's the tactical signature of a commander who has studied every aspect of this battlefield for months. The first fire ship collides with a trapped Mongol junk. Flames leap from vessel to vessel, fed by the pitch and tar that waterproof the hulls. Mongol sailors jump into the river to escape the inferno and discover a new horror. The water is now shallow enough that the iron-tipped stakes protrude above the surface. Men impale themselves trying to swim. Bodies hang from wooden poles like grotesque ornaments. The river runs red. From the riverbanks, Vietnamese archers open fire. They're not trying to sink ships. The stakes are doing that work efficiently. They're targeting survivors, men clinging to wreckage, officers trying to organize evacuation. It's not cruelty, it's arithmetic. Every Mongol soldier who escapes this trap is a soldier who can regroup and return. Tran Hung Dao has committed his nation to total war, and total war has no room for mercy. Togan makes the hardest decision of his military career. All ships retreat. Abandon the vanguard. Get the main fleet out of this river before the tide traps us all. His officers stare at him in disbelief. Abandon 10,000 men? The vanguard includes some of the finest Marines in the Yuan Navy, veterans of campaigns from Java to Japan. But Togan has seen what happens when you chase Vietnamese forces into prepared ground. His father died that way. He will not repeat that mistake. Now, he roars, and the war drums begin beating retreat, a rhythm that every Mongol sailor knows, a rhythm that means survival takes precedence over honor. The remaining 350 ships begin to turn. It's chaos, vessels colliding in the narrow channel, captains screaming contradictory orders, the current fighting every attempt to reverse course. But slowly, painfully, the main body of the fleet begins to extract itself from the trap. Behind them, the vanguard burns and sinks, black smoke rising into the afternoon sky like a funeral pyre from Mongol invincibility. On the eastern bank, Tran Hung Dao turns to Tran Hung Dao. "Commander, they're retreating. Should we pursue with our boats?" The old general watches the Mongol fleet struggle downstream. His face is expressionless, but his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of warfare, grip the hilt of his sword so tightly his knuckles are white. He's 72 years old. He's fought the Mongols 3 times. He knows this is the moment that will decide whether Dai Viet remains independent or becomes another province in Kublai Khan's empire. "No," he says quietly. "Let them run. They'll carry word of what happened here. How a small nation defeated the greatest military force in the world using nothing but knowledge of their own land and the patience to prepare." He turns to face his officers, and for the first time in months, there's something like hope in his eyes. "Send riders to the king. Tell him we've broken their fleet. Tell him Dai Viet still stands." By nightfall, the tide has reached its lowest point. The Bach Dang River is a graveyard. 400 Mongol ships entered at dawn. Fewer than 300 limp toward the sea at dusk, many of them damaged, all of them demoralized. The riverbed is littered with wreckage, broken hulls impaled on stakes, bodies floating in the shallows, weapons and armor glinting in the fading light. Vietnamese soldiers move among the debris, collecting equipment, tending to their own wounded, finishing off enemy survivors who still pose a threat. Tran Quoc Ton, who led the bait boats that lured the Mongols into the trap, stands on the deck of his vessel and stares at the carnage. He's shaking, not from cold, but from the realization of what they've done. The Mongols are not bandits or raiders. They're the force that conquered China, that destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, that made kings and emperors kneel. And today, a relative handful of Vietnamese fishermen and farmers turned soldiers defeated them using wooden stakes and intimate knowledge of tidal patterns. An older soldier, a veteran of the previous invasions, puts a hand on his shoulder. "We won, young commander. We actually won. This battle," Tran Quoc Ton replies, his voice hollow. "But the war?" The veteran smiles grimly. "The Mongols have never been defeated like this. They've lost battles before. Everyone loses battles. But this is humiliation. This is a lesson they won't forget. When word reaches Kublai Khan that his fleet was destroyed by farmers with wooden stakes, he trails off, looking at the burning wrecks. They'll think twice before coming back. He's right. The Battle of Bach Dang River marks the beginning of the end of the third Mongol invasion of Dai Viet. Over the next 3 months, harassed by guerrillas, starved by scorched earth tactics, and haunted by the memory of their naval catastrophe, the Mongol land forces will withdraw across the northern border. Kublai Khan will never again attempt to conquer Vietnam. The empire that conquered most of the known world will stop at the borders of a nation smaller than many of its provinces, stopped not by superior numbers or advanced weapons, but by a people who knew their land better than any invader ever could, and who were willing to sacrifice everything to remain free. January 19th, 1288. Dawn. Mongol command vessel, approaching the coast. Togun has not slept. He stands at the bow of his damaged flagship, watching the sun rise over the South China Sea, and counts the cost of yesterday's disaster. Of the 400 war junks that entered the Bach Dang River, 273 have made it back to open water. 127 remain in that cursed river, sunk, burned, or impaled on Vietnamese stakes. More importantly, nearly 12,000 men are gone, dead, captured, or scattered into the Vietnamese countryside where they'll be hunted down by peasants who know every trail and hiding place. In his hand, he holds a message that arrived by courier boat an hour ago. It's from General Omar, commanding the Mongol land forces still occupying what remains of Tang Long. The message is brief. Vietnamese forces pressing from all sides. Supply situation critical. Disease spreading. Recommend immediate withdrawal to Chinese border. Inalchi approaches, his armor still stained with smoke and blood from yesterday's fighting. General, the captains are requesting orders. Do we attempt another assault on the river? Perhaps at a different location. Togun laughs, a bitter, hollow sound. Another assault? With what fleet? We lost a third of our ships and half our marines. And even if we had 1,000 ships, what then? Sail into another river filled with stakes? Land on a beach mined with traps? March into a jungle where every farmer is a scout and every village is an ambush? He crumples the message in his fist. The Vietnamese don't fight like civilized armies. They fight like the land itself has turned against us. The truth settles over them like fog. This invasion, the third attempt in 30 years, is over. Not because the Mongols lack courage or weapons or numbers, but because they're fighting an enemy that refuses to meet them in the open, that turns geography into weaponry, that makes patience and preparation more powerful than cavalry charges and siege weapons. Send word to General Omar. Togun says quietly, begin the withdrawal. All Mongol forces are to retreat to the Chinese border within 1 month. We cannot hold Dai Viet. We never could. Inalchi's face goes pale. The Great Khan will demand an explanation. How we tell him that we were defeated by wooden stakes, that the largest fleet the Yuan dynasty ever assembled was destroyed by fishermen who knew when the tide changed. We tell him the truth, Togun replies, his voice hard. That Dai Viet cannot be conquered by conventional means. That the Vietnamese are willing to burn their own cities, starve their own people, and sacrifice everything to remain independent. That Tran Hung Dao is not just a general. He's a master of asymmetric warfare who understands that you don't need to win battles if you can make occupation impossible. He turns to face his officer. My father died trying to conquer this country. I will not die repeating his mistakes. We retreat. The order ripples through what remains of the fleet. Captains who expected to return to China as conquerors now prepare to return as survivors of a humiliating defeat. The Mongol Empire, which has toppled kingdoms from Korea to Hungary, has been stopped by a nation that most of the world has never heard of, using tactics that will be studied by military strategists for centuries to come. 3 weeks later, February 10th, 1288. Tang Long, abandoned Mongol headquarters. Tran Hung Dao walks through the ruins of his nation's capital. The Mongols burned what they couldn't take with them: warehouses, administrative buildings, even some of the ancient temples. But they're gone now, retreating north in a column that stretches for miles, harassed every step of the way by Vietnamese guerrillas who have turned from defenders into pursuers. King Tran Nan Tong approaches, flanked by what remains of his court. The king is young, only 34, but the past 6 months have aged him. Still, there's something new in his bearing now. Confidence born from survival, pride earned through resistance. Uncle, the king says, Tran Hung Dao is his great-uncle, part of the extended royal family that has ruled Dai Viet for 3 generations. The reports from the north confirm it. The last Mongol soldier crossed the border yesterday. They're gone. Tran Hung Dao nods slowly. He should feel triumphant. Instead, he feels exhausted. 3 invasions in 30 years. 3 times, his people have sacrificed everything to remain free. 3 times, they've proven that military might alone cannot conquer a determined population fighting on home ground. Your Majesty, Tran Hung Dao says formally, the war is won. But the cost? He gestures at the burned city around them. We must rebuild. We must remember. And we must prepare, because history shows that empires rarely accept defeat gracefully. But in this case, the empire will accept defeat. Kublai Khan, receiving news of the Bach Dang disaster, will rage and threaten. But he will not invade again. The cost is too high, the terrain too difficult, the enemy too unconventional. Dai Viet will remain independent for another 6 centuries, its survival a testament to the power of guerrilla warfare, strategic preparation, and intimate knowledge of local geography. The king places a hand on his uncle's shoulder. What you did at Bach Dang, the stakes, the timing, the patience, historians will study it for 1,000 years. Perhaps, Tran Hung Dao replies, but I hope they also remember the soldiers who drove those stakes into the mud until their hands bled, the farmers who burned their own crops, the families who abandoned their homes. Victory doesn't belong to generals. It belongs to people who refuse to surrender, no matter the cost. He turns to look at the Bach Dang River in the distance, where 10,000 stakes still stand beneath the water, monuments to ingenuity and desperation. The river runs clean again, the bodies buried, the wreckage cleared. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the collective memory of a nation that proved the impossible. That David can defeat Goliath, that the weak can overcome the strong, that freedom is worth any sacrifice. The Mongol Empire will continue its expansion elsewhere, conquering territories from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. But they will never return to Dai Viet. The memory of 10,000 stakes, rising from the riverbed like iron teeth to devour the mightiest fleet in the world, will ensure that. History will record the Battle of Bach Dang River as one of the greatest military upsets of all time, a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated how preparation, patience, and knowledge of terrain can overcome overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Tran Hung Dao's strategy will be studied in military academies centuries later, his use of natural forces and environmental warfare recognized as pioneering asymmetric tactics that would influence guerrilla warfare from the American Revolution to modern conflicts. But for now, in February 1288, it's simply a miracle, the survival of a small nation against impossible odds, secured by wooden stakes driven into river mud by hands that refused to stop bleeding, refused to stop working, refused to stop believing that freedom was worth fighting for.